This is from the second book, but the only spoiler in it is that my main character is an astronaut at this point, which I trust is not a spoiler since the title of the series is the Lady Astronaut series. So, you know. So everything is ruined now. So this is from The Fated Sky, and part of the reason that I'm reading this section is because it takes place in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. And I actually got to go to the Neutral Buoyancy Lab and watch a full development run, with an astronaut. And the astronaut, Kjell Lindgren, said, you know, when he was inviting me, he's like, do you want to come and watch me do this? You'll be able to watch the suit up and everything. You can hang out all day, but you probably won't want to because it'll be really boring. And I'm like, so Kjell, you know how I'm a professional puppeteer? Next time you're in New York, if you want to go hang out on Sesame Street, let me know. But you probably won't want to hang out all day because it'll be really boring. He acknowledged I had a point. And spoiler, not boring at all. So I also do the audiobooks, and what you're going to see, aside from the presence of a microphone and headphones, is actually the way I recorded this in the studio. The thing about wearing a spacesuit on Earth is that it's designed for lower gravity. Even being in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab's pool didn't change the fact that gravity pulled at me. Sure, it didn't pull at the suit, but inside, I slid around every time I changed orientation. As a woman, I was smaller than the men the suits had been designed for, so I had to wear padding around my hips to sort of wedge me in. This kept the air bubble surrounding me inside the suit distributed evenly, allowing me to move from horizontal to vertical over the course of the NBL run without fighting gravity. Without the padding, the air bubble acted like a giant beach ball strapped to my stomach, always wanting to be pointed up toward the surface. It made it difficult to roll in any other direction. In truth, having an air bubble inside the suit wouldn't be a problem in space. But the NBL was where people decided if you had what it took to do a spacewalk, so neither I nor any of the other women would complain. No, sir. Everything was splendid, and we were happy to be in the pool. I hung sideways in the water with the fiberglass shell digging into my armpit. My neck burned from holding my head up inside my helmet. My fingers ached from forcing my stiff gloves to close on the edge of the solar panel we were practicing repairing. With the suits pressurized to 4.9 psi above ambient pressure, every movement felt like working against a heavy-duty spring. It wasn't exactly like working in a vacuum, but it gave us a sense of how exhausting it would be. A wrinkle in my glove felt like a metal wire across my knuckle as the pressure made it rigid. But if you asked me how I was doing, I would be so very, very chipper. On the other side of the panel, Rafael Avelino swore in Portuguese as his glove slid off the wrench. Our support divers floated in a pod around us and let the wrench drift away. Their job was to keep us safe, and ours was to learn how to do repairs in zero-G. Tethered to the MWS, or mini workstation, on the chest of a spacesuit, the wrench didn't go far, but it was still a pain reeling it in. As Rafael's curses buzzed over the comm, I grinned inside my helmet. I'm beginning to understand why Parker is learning Portuguese. On my left and slightly below me, Leonard helped me steady the panel as Rafael got the wrench back into place.
We all need more languages to swear in. I've just got Latin and Greek, and there's only so far that can take you.
Oh yeah? What's a Latin curse like?
Rafael placed the wrench again and reseated his feet in the foot restraint secured in a WIF mechanical receptor on the mock-up exterior of our craft. What does WIF stand for? No idea. At a certain point, the acronyms just become the name. WIF was Widget Interface Forget About It? That's the actual answer that I got from an actual astronaut when I asked what that meant. One of the many benefits to building the ships in space was that we didn't have to worry about aerodynamics. Whiffs and grips covered the surface of the ship. Rafael's wrench slipped again, but he didn't lose his grasp.
Because I could use some more curses right now.
Leonard hesitated and then chuckled.
Actually, most of them aren't things I can say in mixed company.
Please. I braced against my foot restraint as Rafael finally got the wrench engaged. Say the fucking Latin. That got a huge laugh from both men, though my face flamed at having said it. Thank God the helmets meant they couldn't see me clearly. Even for a laugh, that kind of language was not in my normal vocabulary. And then, predictably, Jason Sauer, Sim Soup du jour, crackled into our ears.
Language. Va me puto concave me.
Leonard intoned with great solemnity. Rafael's head came up in his helmet.
That is close enough to Portuguese that I actually understood it. Mostly.
Gentleman. Lady.
For a guy from Chicago, Tsao could be so prim sometimes.
We have visitors and they are listening.
The three of us exchanged glances and Rafael rolled his eyes.
What language do they speak?
English.
Through the microphone, we could just make out someone talking in the background, but not the substance of the conversation. The Sim Soup's response was sharp and biting.
No, bringing them up early is absolutely out of the...
And then his mic cut off. What had that been? Through the water, I couldn't see what the guys thought, so I just stood there bracing the panel. It wasn't like the Sim Soup to leave his mic open, which raised the question of what sort of visitors would distract him that badly, to say nothing of who might be asking us to come out of the NBL early. Rafael got that bolt tightened down, and we moved on as a unit to extend the next piece of the panel. This was the fourth time we'd done this particular NBL run, and each time we got a little faster. Of course, it wasn't likely that I would be the one doing the EVA, but the IAC believed in over-preparation, and after my late start, I supported them in that. Besides, it would make being the IV person, the intravehicular person, easier if I knew what they were facing. Given the communication lags we would have during the mission, we couldn't rely on ground control to coach the EV team in every scenario.
Folks, we're going to stand down on extending the array.
The Sim Soup's voice crackled, then the microphone rustled and shifted as though he were handing it off. We floated underwater with the constant hum of fans and sound of our own breath as company. Then Director Clemens came on the comm.
We have to pull Dr. Flannery out, but Dr. York and Captain Avellino will stay and work through the cleanup. Dr. Flannery, I need you out of the pool pronto.
Leonard drew a breath as if he was going to argue, then snapped his mouth shut so hard I heard his teeth click.
Yes, sir. See you topside.
I am ashamed to say that my primary emotion was not curiosity or even annoyance that our training had been interrupted, but relief that for once it wasn't me. Leonard turned from us and let the divers drag him through the water to the platform that would carry him to the surface. Rafael and I floated in the pool. I let my head slump against the side of my helmet and closed my eyes for a moment while our support divers reconfigured the ship mock-up to the end state of the run. It took so long to get into the suits that it made sense to let us practice the end of the run while we were already down there. I kept listening to the comm, waiting for Tsao to tell us something else about what was happening with Leonard. When the divers were ready for us, we started the run again, but kept conversation to the bare minimum required for work. After I got over my relief, I had a huge case of, what the devil is going on? I'd been pulled out of training before, but not an actual NBL run. That required restarting the entire thing, which was expensive and an enormous loss of training time. Heck, the way the suits were configured, it took 2 days just to replace a crew member. Short of a medical emergency or equipment malfunction, nothing interrupted an NBL run. So what would Clemens think was so important that it couldn't wait, and why weren't they telling us? The lift out of the NBL's pool took ages. As my helmet breached the surface of the water, the stand I was strapped to supported the 140 kilograms of my suit. Trying to walk in a full suit in Earth gravity is not possible. Even just the bottoms are like, well, it's like wearing diapers in a snowsuit made of lead. The robot in Lost in Space had more grace than we did. I hung in the donning stand as a swarm of suit techs helped us to disrobe. When you want answers, everything seems to take longer. I waited for my suit tech to remove the tools and tethers and leg weights. As much as I wanted to rush her, everything had to be done in sequence. On the other side of the donning stand, Rafael was going through the same slow, careful extraction from his spacesuit. It was like my suit tech was moving underwater as she opened the valve on the side to depressurize the spacesuit down to below 1. Sure, I could talk now and she could hear me, along with everyone else listening on my comms. My suit tech put her hands on the release of my gloves. Breathe out. I exhaled as the remaining bit of delta pressure released when she popped the glove. It wasn't likely that I would blow out a lung, but over precautions were the IAC's stock in trade. The suit settled around me as she pulled the glove away, then finally she reached for the helmet. The moment it was off, I asked her, "What's going on?" She glanced over her shoulder at the control room. "We were told to get you cleaned up as fast as possible. It's the FBI."
Thanks for that reading.
Sure.
So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you about, since this was looking back at kind of an alternate history of the space race, how much research did you end up doing? What was your favorite bit of research? And was there a piece that just didn't make the cut?
So researching this was a lot of reading of autobiographies. I focused mostly on the Mercury and Apollo era. And then also I looked at the WASPs, the Women Air Force, or the Women Air Service pilots from World War II. So those were kind of the primary areas of book research. The other thing that I did was that I lined up some topic experts. So I had Stephen Grenade. I used him as my science consultant for the whole thing. He read the entire book. He does rocket science. He does robotics. He was a chemistry major, like NASA, Goddard. He's done all of that. Then I also had a couple of astronauts, Kjell Lindgren, who was the one who invited me to the NBL, and Katie Coleman, who's a shuttle-era astronaut, and an actual lady astronaut. She's the one who gave me a lot of the details about having to put the padding around the hips in the NBL, which is something the guys don't have to do. And then also had people, like I had a Judaism consultant, because my main character is Jewish and I am not. So it was lots of that sort of reading. One of the things that I would say was kind of surprising was I was aware of the Mercury 13 and kind of like very loose, like I think someone has mentioned something about it at some point, but I didn't actually know really anything about them. And so the Mercury 13 were women who were put through the Mercury testing program. To see how women performed. And some of the things that I was surprised by was that we actually performed better than the guys. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that we tend to be smaller, but also the way our circulatory system works, partly because designed for carrying babies and things like that, we handle G-forces significantly better than men. The other thing, and this was my favorite thing, was when they did the stress testing. All of the women performed better than the men in the stress testing. And the one that I was like, oh, well, that's why. And the delightful surprise was one of them was a mother of 8. So I just imagine her getting into the stress testing and being like, what? Oh, there's unexpected noises going off? Oh, okay. I have to do a complex task while someone is trying to get my attention? Whatevs. Is it nap time now? I mean... So I loved that, and I mention her in there. I wanted to actually get her in as a major character and couldn't quite get her in. And there were other things that, like one of the things that I really wanted to get into the books that I couldn't find a spot for was astronauts do survival training. Okay. So they send them out and they're like, okay, we're going to drop you in a desert, or we're going to drop you in this snowy wasteland. We'll see you in 7 days. Bye-bye. And could not work that in. There was a lot of training stuff that I was like, oh, I want this so badly. No space. In space.
For the Mercury...
Pity laugh.
For the Mercury 13, like, what was the sort of conclusion from some of that research, or how did they couch, like, yeah, thanks for showing up, but like, no thanks?
So what happened is they got through the initial testing. They were getting ready to go into the next stage, which required using some special equipment at NASA. And went to NASA, and NASA went to Lyndon Johnson, and he said, no, absolutely not. And he drafted a letter saying, let's shut this thing down. He never sent the letter. What the letter he sent was, well, of course, I'll leave it up to you. And strangely, that meant that nothing happened. the requirements then for who could become a astronaut shifted so that you had to have, right around in this time, and I'm sure it's completely coincidental, that shifted so you had to have so many hours as a pilot in command of a jet, which was something that only military fighter pilots could have. So it goes on to have, they go on to have congressional hearings. Like they fought this to continue the training and the testing, and they go to congressional hearings, and the congressional hearings are basically lots of things like, you know, men go into space, women take care of the home, and other things like, well, you know, of course we'd take any woman who met the qualifications, and they're
That
like,
we just very carefully crafted.
right,
Right.
right. So lots of things like that, and one of the things actually that also came up in those hearings was, so John Glenn was there, and one of the women was like, you know, but you wouldn't have qualified with the standards that they have now, because when he qualified, when they put him there, you know, first orbit, or first man really, Shepard was the first up, but Glenn was the first to orbit. When you did that, they didn't have the requirement for advanced degrees, and he got an advanced degree later, but he wouldn't have qualified. And they're like, well, you did, you know, why not look at equivalent things? And the other thing was that most of the women had more flight time than any of the astronauts did before they went in, because the Air Service, the WASPs were flying constantly. They had a lot of them. I think all of the Mercury 13 had like over 1,000 hours of flight time clocked. They were very impressive pilots.
So let's take a step back for a second. So we read that section of the book. Could you just talk a little bit about why you chose the particular point in time to start
Sure.
the series, and what were some of the decisions around that?
Right. So the series starts in 1952 when I slam a meteor into the Chesapeake Bay. This is not a spoiler. I literally do this on the first line of the novel. And that's my cusp point. There is actually technically a cusp point before that, which is that I have Dewey as the president, because I needed the space program to be slightly more advanced. The reason I chose the 1950s is that this was a point at which computers were women. That was, if you said computer, you meant someone who did math. And mechanical computers were not really, I mean, they existed, but they were definitely far from reliable. So if you wanted a computer in space, at that point, it had to be a woman. And what I was looking at basically was, what are the things that would make people change their mind about sending women into space? Having a task that was defined in that era as a woman's job, which was computing. That was one thing. Making it an extinction level event, so that we had to be talking about colonies, so that it's like, you know, and again, one of the conversations they have in the book is like, you know, if you want a colony, you kind of, there's this component that you need there that guys don't have. Maybe you want to send some?
A one-time colony.
You know,
Yeah.
just. But mostly it was because of the computing.
Okay.
I needed technology to be at a point at which we had the ability to go into space, but before we had computers, mechanical computers, and 1952. 1952 also. There's a short story that comes before the novels that no one in the universe of the novels is aware of. And for that, there needed to be a plot point that revolved around leap year and miscalculating something based on leap day.
Okay.
Getting to which no one in their universe knows about, but it was. So that's why it's 1952 specifically, and
Gotcha.
March 3rd.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the events of the book take place in, you know, an era that a lot of us are familiar with, right? And one thing as a reader, it is a sci-fi series, but at the same time, like, you don't have to spend a lot of time explaining like magical infinite power sources or faster than light travel or other nonsense, right? How did you make choices about like what to go into detail on the sort of like hard sci-fi side versus, the story elements or the characters?
I am very sneaky about this. So I am, I was an art major in college. I'm a professional puppeteer. I read books out loud for a living and write things. Math is a magic system as far as I'm concerned. It's like people can do amazing things with math, and I understand that intellectually, and bully for them. So I treated it like a magic system. One of the things that I did was to set up the rules very clearly and to establish my character's competence right at the beginning. There is a scene very early on in which Elma is trying to calculate the size of the meteor because it's gone into the Chesapeake Bay, try to figure out how big it was. Because she's trying to prove that the Russians could not have moved it and aimed it because it is Cold War.
Right, of course.
So she's trying to demonstrate this. And Stephen Grenade gave me this very long email in which he walked me through how this equation. I found the equation. I'm like, I can tell that this equation does this thing, but I don't understand any of the things that are actually happening here. So he did the math, walked me through it, and then I just gave that to my characters. And there's a conversation where they're throwing technical terms at each other. And you know how when you're working on something and you'll just be like, so, okay, and then number of joules, and you just say occasional words out loud. So I have my characters do that, which makes them sound super smart. And like all of the math that they're saying out loud is correct, right? And then later I can get away with saying, and then I did the calculations, and people are like, oh, well, she totally knows what the calculations are, obviously. So I would explain it enough to establish competence, and then the only other times that I would explain it is if it was something that you needed to know in order to understand something further down the line. So like the NBL scene is basically establishing competence in space.
Right.
And also giving me the, it's like, this is what a whiff is, so that later when the whiff is important, I don't have to stop and say, while this incredibly tense scene is happening, a whiff, by the way, is a widget interface. No.
Right.
I can't remember what it actually does stand for. He did tell me later, but he had to go look it up.
The first answer is pretty good.
It is, widget interface. Yeah. I told him, I was like, that's going directly in the book. He's like, abort, abort. I'm like,
too late.
In.
Yeah. Well, I like that in the book, a lot of that does feel very natural, and like it is introduced like when it helps the story, and it's not. There's no sort of long-winded section about like, oh, let me geek out on this particular detail. As a reader, I could tell you did a lot of fun research around that, but it also fits so well into the story and what the characters are up to at any given point.
Awesome, thank you. That's so I find that is very much about focus, like just providing it when the character is thinking about it naturally.
Yeah. So let's go back and forward a little bit.
All right, I'm excited.
Is it correct that The Lady Astronaut of Mars was the first piece you did in this world?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's the one that I won the Hugo for.
Okay.
The first piece that I that I wrote in this world is a story that's called "We Interrupt This Broadcast," and this is the one that I said that no one in this universe knows. And I wrote something that I jokingly call this my punch card punk universe. And the story is basically a computer engineer who has decided that society is going nowhere good, and that it needs a hard reset, and the meteor is actually aimed and targeted, but he dies in the blast. So no one in this timeline knows it ever. It's never going to be a plot point. No one will ever know it.
Okay.
As far as everyone in this universe is concerned, it was an act of God. But that's the first thing that I wrote. And then Lady Astronaut of Mars is the second thing. And for that, that's what prompted these books. So I knew that she had this backstory, but the book, that story itself came up because I needed to write something for an audio anthology called Rip Off, where we took a famous first line, and I took the first line of Wizard of Oz, and then wrote this story. And that, honestly, the reason I set it in the Punch Card Punk universe for that one was that I had a deadline and I had this universe already created.
That's a good choice.
So it's like, why do this additional work when this is just here? And also I like it. Like, I like the idea of what we were able to do in that era. You know, the fact that there's, you know, my cell phone has more computing power than we had in the entire planet. And we sent people to the moon, like in basically these Jiffy Pop containers. It's amazing, you know, and all of the calculations that were done, you know,
Right.
like with people just doing calculations. So anyway, so that's, I don't think that I answered your question.
No, that was good. I clearly have to go back and read the other piece because I have not read that one yet. One of the things I love about the Lady Astronaut on Mars story is it feels very much like it could be kind of, in some ways, like a lost chapter of like the Martian Chronicles or something. Has that same vibe. You bring some Bradbury in later.
Yeah.
And you know, that was me as a fan of that stuff. I was very excited about that. But also, it sets up this really rich world with so little. Like, it is a very short story, and it like has a really, really powerful arc to it. But it also is not heavy on detail. Like, it sets up just enough so that you can connect the dots and kind of know where that, you know, how we got there or how those characters got there. But then also when the first novel came out, knowing that, since that is set farther in the future than the first novel, like I instantly cared a lot about those characters too.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you felt the Bradbury vibe, because that was actually that was something I thought of it as my homage to Bradbury when I was writing it. I'm like, I want the Martian Chronicles, but with more women.
Solid choice.
Yeah. And then it's basically, it's like the novels are, I would like the Martian Chronicles, but with more women and people of color, please. And just not all white dudes all the time. But one of the things that was interesting about coming back to write this original, was figuring out, you know, it's there's a 40-year gap between them. So trying to figure out who Elma was, who Nathaniel was. One of the things that I knew going back was that I wanted their relationship to always be rock solid. Like, I did not want the, you know, marriage to ever be in jeopardy. Partly because I hate that trope a lot. Oh, now we fight. Oh, we're going to break up. And no, we're deeply in love again. I'm like, oh. Well, that's not predictable. So I didn't want to do that. So I thought about those things and kind of how she would get there over that time. And also, you know, like how do you become the Lady Astronaut of Mars? Like, how does that become your name? What happened?
Yeah, as a moniker, it's a solid moniker.
It is.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, it was also fun in the books to see a really exciting, solid married couple as well. And there's a lot of fun in that relationship. Yeah, as a longtime married person, I was like, oh yeah, look, that's good. Anyway, so you have also written, so you're not exclusively a sci-fi writer.
Correct.
You've written in several different styles and genres. How do you think about what story is right? Or do you start with your story idea? Do you start with a setting? Like, could you just talk a little bit about your process there?
Yeah, so it varies from story to story. Sometimes I'll come into it and like I know the world and I know the setting and I have to find the character. Sometimes I know the character and I need to figure out the world around them, or I have just like a scene that I know that I want to write. And so then it's finding the other pieces of it. A lot of times we liken this to gardening. But in terms of whether I do science fiction or fantasy, these are, for me, I think of them very much as set dressing. So there are some stories that have a specific inherent structure, like heist stories have a specific inherent structure. Romances have a specific inherent structure. But the science fiction, fantasy, these are the set dressing. This is the layer that goes on top of that structure. Because you can have a science fiction story that is a hardcore romance, And you can also have one that's a heist novel, same with fantasy. So what I tend to do is I think about the interstitial layers, the stuff, the connecting tissue, because what I find both things do, the science fiction and the fantasy, is they allow me to take the natural world, tip it to the side so I can see all that connective tissue. And then it also allows me to explore things that I am thinking about from the real world. And it allows me to talk about them without all of the emotional baggage, so I can approach them much more as a thought experiment, which then also allows my readers to engage with it more naturally. So what I look for then is kind of what scenic design is going to support that. It's very much the same process I go through when I'm designing a show. It's like, what is the aesthetic that is going to serve this? Is this a story that's going to be served by something that's darker and grittier? Is this a story that, that mechanics are going to serve? Do I feel like I really need communication to be a difficult thing, in which case fantasy is going to work for me much better than science fiction. Like all of the things where I'm like, why don't you just call them on a cell phone? The number of the difficulty in disabling cell phones, like, and removing communication, that is like one of the number one problems with writing science fiction today. It's like, why are you just not?
Yeah, instantaneous communication.
Yeah. It's always like having to put people in Faraday boxes. So I look at that kind of thing.
Okay. Calculating Stars and Faded Sky are the two most recent novels. We were talking about it earlier. You didn't intend it to be two novels originally, right?
I did not, no. My plan with this was to write a single novel, which I had just titled The Lady Astronaut Book. Had no idea what it was going to be. There was a point where it was Artemis 1, like ridiculous. We went through 20 titles for this. I'm not kidding. But what happened was that my idea had been that I was going to structure it as 3 novellas, because the Lady Astronaut of Mars was a novella, and I was like, I'll structure it as 3 linked novellas to mimic the structure of Lady Astronaut of Mars. And part 1 of Calculating Stars is that first novella, more or less untouched. And I'd finished part 2 and was starting part 3, and it felt awful. And what I realized was happening was that I was having to skip emotional beats in the second novella in order to save them for the third one, so I didn't have repetition points. And the other thing was that people read short fiction for a different thing than they read novels for. Like, people read short fiction for kind of a swift emotional punch to the gut, and people read novels for immersion. And structuring it as 3 novellas, if I had actually published them as 3 independent novellas, I think I would have been fine. I think I would have been able to hit all of the things I wanted to hit. But because it was in novel form, I was having to skip the immersion aspect of it. I'm like, this is not going to be satisfying for a novel reader, because reading these back to back like this. So I went to my editor and I'm like, so I said all of those things. And they were great, and they let me split it into 2 books, which allowed me to unpack everything so that part 2 is significantly more robust. I was able to do a lot more of the training stuff that I was going to have to, that in the original one I had to skip. And then could really unpack the third one to include a lot, again, training and some additional things that otherwise I just would have had to skip in order to have that quick in that you would have for a novella.
Okay. And you've had some exciting news recently on the new books front, right?
Yes.
So we have more Lady Astronaut books.
Yes. We just sold 3 new novels to Tor.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And it's a 6-figure deal, which I'm extremely excited by. Thank you. It's my first. It's very exciting. And thank you for the sympathy clap there. As I do humble brags up here. But
feel free.
Thank you. I appreciate it. For those of you who watch Good Place, I'm totally Tahani. Fork, yeah. So the first book, or I should say the third book, is called The Relentless Moon. That'll come out in 2020. I have to turn it in June, which I'm exhilarated and terrified by. But that one is a parallel novel to The Faded Sky. So it's taking place while everybody, The Faded Sky again, I don't feel like this is a spoiler. If you look at the cover and you know that the books are coming from a series that began with The Lady Astronaut of Mars, the fact that they're going to Mars, and it's a red cover of someone standing on the surface of Mars, I feel like, surprise!
It's a safe spoiler.
Safe bet there. Anyway, so this takes place while the first Mars expedition is going on. And it focuses on Nicole Worgan and Myrtle Lindholm, who are two of the side characters in the first book, first and second book. And then basically it's like, hello, we are on the moon and we're trying to establish life here, and bridge parties are difficult because the gravity is so low, and oh no, sabotage. So it's much more in the, it's going to have a little bit more of a thriller vein than some of the other ones. And then in 2021, we have a non-Lady Astronaut book, which is The Spare Man, which is basically, if anyone's seen the Thin Man movies, it's basically the Thin Man in space. It's an interstellar cruise ship. It's a locked room murder mystery, happily married couple and their dog. Astra. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Someone has watched the Thin Man movies and knows Latin. And then in 2022, which does not sound like a real date at all, we will have The Derivative Base, which picks up after the close of Faded Sky, and it's Elma and Nathaniel again.
Awesome. Yeah, congrats again.
Thanks.
It's big news.
I'm super excited by it.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the other stuff around being an author now, right? So people probably still have some notion of the author as like, locked in a writing cabin in the woods somewhere.
That's not inaccurate, no.
But, you as a modern author, and especially of popular fiction, right? Like, you have a lot of interaction with people, like, probably partly as an obligation and partly for fun. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance that out?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about being an author is that the interaction with the public has always been part of the game. Like, the reason that Charles Dickens became so popular and Mark Twain was actually because they did public readings all the time. Mm-hmm. So that was a lot of what drove their fame and fortune. So that audience engagement kind of is always there. It's so much easier now and harder all at the same time. So I spend a surprising amount of time on the road. Things that they don't tell you when you sign the standard rich and famous contract, that you are going to have to be. Thank you for the people who watch the Muppets. So you kind of travel all the time. So I'm like, right now I have been home for 2 weeks. Before that, I had been on the road for 20 days. I had been home for a day before that. And then 2 weeks prior to that, 3 days home. And it's like this year has just kind of been like that. And it is partly my own fault, because I will say, yes, I'd love to come do that thing. Also partly because I have a couple of different careers running in tandem. But the thing that's nice about it is that you actually can have a career without doing that, in theory, through the internet, which is both good and bad. Like when I go to an event, the people who attend, there's a certain buy-in that they have to do to just show up. Mm-hmm. So everybody that I'm interacting with is generally very pleasant. I've had the occasional stalker, but not terrible compared to some friends. On the internet, I will have trolls come at me for reasons. And as far as I can tell, it's just, because they felt like it that day.
Sure.
And it is interesting trying to, that balancing act of wanting to be present, wanting to engage, and also needing to preserve aspects of self. So the thing that I talk about is that mostly what I think about is, it's not that I put on a persona, but that I decide which parts of my life are public and which parts of my life are private. Like, I rarely talk about my family. And one of the things or when I do, it's always just bragging about them. One of the things we were talking about at lunch was that I had shingles during this 20 days of travel. And I did not want to talk about it, because as soon as you talk about anything health-related on the internet, everyone will give you advice. Like, everyone. I have a hangnail. Well, have you tried? I think at this point in my life, I know how to deal with a hangnail.
You seem like a sensible adult.
I try. But I also had to cancel things. And I didn't want to just be like, oh, I'm just canceling things. So, and I didn't want people to go, she's canceling things. Is she dying? Because they will also go there, because in fairness, that is, has happened. So, unfortunately, trying to decide how much to talk about. So, like, I'll tell people I had shingles. I do not talk about, actually, no, in the blog post I did talk about the degree of pain that I was in. But I talked about, what I tried to do was talk about it in terms of, here's a learning experience for you. The show does not have to go on. Don't use my puppeteer work ethic. Take care of yourself. Be healthy. So it's learning to couch things and shift them so that I maintain control of the conversation, which I'm very grateful for, having years of theater before. Like, I learned all of this from dealing with third graders.
Excellent. So you're, there's a lot of looking back at the events of the past in the most recent novels, right, with a modern lens, and from the perspective of people struggling through that era, right? How has the reception been to that, or has that sort of like attracted some of the more unsavory fan elements because, you are, criticizing some of their golden ideas or, whatever nonsense is coming up?
The thing that, like, when people complain about these books, for the most part, it has been very, very positive. I have to say,
Great.
Really super positive. And one of the things, I do deal with sexism and racism. I deal with mental health issues. But at the same time, I feel like it's not so much, like, in my head, I'm writing a book about these things. I'm writing a book about space, but I'm not ignoring those things. Yeah. And that, because so many books do ignore them, I think that's what makes it feel like they're very, very present. These are things that affect the way characters move through the world. And so I'm letting it affect the way they move through the world. But I'm not, like, for the most part, they aren't. There's like one or two places where it's a plot point, but for the most part, it's like, this is the way they move through the world. Sexism is a plot point for Elma because it's a plot point for me. I get, when I was vice president of SFWA, Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and John Scalzi was president, I got the hate mail. He didn't. It's not that he didn't get any, but I would get the majority of it. So it just affects the way you move through the world. So I was dealing with those things. So when people complain about it, what they complain about is, oh, she's shoehorning in these social issues. I'm like, no, really not. That's just daily life. That's the complaint that I'll get. The other one that I'll get is Elma, the main character, has social anxiety disorder. So, she's in a plane and it's going down and she's totally fine. You ask her to speak to a room full of people and she's like, no, I clearly do not have social anxiety disorder. Theater. Although there are a lot of people in theater who do. But what I would get, the other pushback that I'll get is, I don't believe that someone, who gets this upset about talking to people, like, no one gets that upset about it. I'm like, yeah, actually. And what I have found is that people with anxiety disorders are the best people in crises, because they're like, what, stress hormones? Come on, bring it. I got this, totally, that's my daily life.
So I have one more question, and then I think we've got time for Q&A. Sort of on that topic of like working through a challenge. Earlier we were also talking about like how you approach writing as sort of a craft as well as a creative endeavor.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about how you view that and how it related to any of your work?
Sure. So because I come at it from theater where you couldn't wait for the muse to arrive. It's like if I'm creating something, if I'm designing something, I have to be able to produce on a deadline because I put other people's schedule behind. It's not a good team player thing to do. So I had to learn to be creative on demand. And I also have depression. So one of the things that I've learned is that I can work through depression, but it's incredibly difficult. And like the whole the creator as the depressed genius, it's like every time that one comes up, I get stabby. Because what happens for me is that my productivity just crashes and burns. And I mentioned briefly at lunch Forest of Memory, which is a novella that was on Tor.com. I wrote that during like the worst depressive episode that I have had. I had my grandmother had died, my cat had died unexpectedly, like right after that. Multiple deaths, like right in a row, a whole bunch of other things, chemical imbalance, all of that. And upon realizing finally what was happening to me, this was the episode that finally made me admit it, that I had depression and had it all my life. In the middle of that, I was trying to drop everything, and there was this one anthology, Metatropolis, Cascadia, and my friend Jay Lake was the editor, and it was the second book in a shared world anthology, so replacing me was already going to be difficult. And Jay was in the process of dying from colon cancer. Like he was terminal. There was no way I was going to back out of this. Like really, this was not something I could do to my friend. So that meant that I just had to write it. And I crafted my way through that story. And people read it and they can't tell at the end of the day. It's because I understand my craft, because I understand audience, storytelling, structure. But I wrote that there were some days that I wrote it, I could only write 3 sentences. That was my bargain with myself. I'm like, 3 sentences. You can do 3 sentences a day. And there's some days where I would catch fire and I could go longer, and other days where I would write 3 sentences. And there are a couple of days where the 3 sentences were, I hate everything, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. But I sat down and I wrote them. And for me, this is important because while I can write that way, but I don't enjoy it. And my feeling now is if I am not writing and not loving it, like if I am dealing with depression, unless there is a really serious reason that I need to push through that it is better for me to take care of myself and to go and have some, and do self-care, and then come back to it when writing there's still joy there, because honestly, we don't get paid enough to write when it's not fun, even with a 6-figure deal that's like spread out over multiple years. But it is good to know that I can, that the time that I've put in learning my craft allows me to actually do this thing. So it's kind of both. It's like one of the things that I try to pay attention to when I start bogging down is like, am I bogging down because there's a problem with the story, or am I bogging down because of something external? And one of you handle those in different ways.
Sure. Well, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So first off, let's give a round of applause to Mary Robinette. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a mic over here, so we have time for questions. We got like 13 minutes.
And I will answer questions about anything. So if you want to know, like we didn't talk about puppetry, if you want to know about puppetry, if you want to know about Regency underwear, if you want to know about going to NASA and the NBL, if you want to know about trying on a space helmet, anything, I'll talk about depression, anything. I will also just sit here and stare at you awkwardly.
I'd like to hear about more than a dozen typewriters.
Yes, we have more than a dozen typewriters. So we have 19 manual typewriters. First of all, I do not recommend that you collect typewriters. They are heavy when you move. They're very heavy. All of your friends hate you if you have those. But Our earliest typewriter is a Blickensderfer, which is a typewriter from 1890, or I think ours is 1893 model, or 1894, anyway. But it has a rotary head, and it's not a QWERTY keyboard. And the cool thing about the rotary head is, you remember the IBM Selectrics? This predates an IBM Selectric by 70 years, and has a rotary head. You can replace it to change the type font. Really, really cool. My favorite is the Corona No. 3, which was the typewriter that Hemingway took. I don't have his. That would be awesome. But it's the typewriter that he used when he was doing war reporting in the First World War, and it's a folding typewriter. So it's this tiny thing. It's like about that big footprint, weighs about 3 pounds. There's an aluminum one that's just stupidly light. And then the top flips back and forth. I have the Corona No. 3 Special, which is forest green. It's beautiful, and it has the extended keyboard that has mathematical functions on it. It's very cool. I will not give you a rundown of all of the typewriters. Probably.
Does having 19 of them help you write faster?
It is, no. But I will actually bring out the typewriter to write sometimes because it changes the rhythms with which you write. And there are times when just changing the medium of communication is enough to shake a story idea loose, or you want that rhythm. Because with a manual typewriter, because you have to hit the carriage return at the end of each line, there's a moment where you're doing a little composition at the end of each line, and then when you have to change the paper, there's another moment of composition. So it does completely change the way I write. But yeah.
I saw you at American Writers Museum.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty sure you gave this anecdote from your research where you found out that the voice for computer in Star Trek is really modeled very much. That was really surprising to me, but it actually makes sense. Can you say more about that and what you learned when you found that bit of information?
All right. So I am. Some of this is me extrapolating. So let's be clear. So one of the interesting things about computer voices in the United States is that they tend, by and large, to be women. And we know that the people who the people who have, like with Siri and Alexa and these other things, that the people have said very specifically that they were thinking about the computer on Star Trek when they assigned the female voice and when they were thinking about it. What's interesting is that Star Trek, California, JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So if you're doing research on space travel, JPL is the closest place that you're going to be able to go when Star Trek was coming out. JPL had a policy that the only people they hired for the computer department were women. They did not hire men as a policy. And from early days. So the computer voices, so that means that you've got this room full of men at a launch, and someone will say, "Computer, give us the velocity," and this one lone woman's voice will come out and answer. When you look at Germany, their computer voices tend to be male. When you look at their early space program, their computers tended to be men. Now, I don't know that there is I have correlation, which is not the same as causation, but there certainly seems to be a pattern there where it looks very much like life, or art imitating life, imitating art again. So I find this back and forth really fascinating.
So I have a daughter who I stole the scarf from that I was telling you about, and she's in a Girl Scout group that's focused. They're doing this Lego robotics focused on space exploration, and I would love to hear your thoughts on like a topic that would be, as you did all this research, what would be an interesting topic that, especially a group of girls, and kind of those dynamics with all those challenges that were there early on, what would be an interesting topic for them to pick as a research project?
So it's interesting. One of the things that you make me think about when you ask that is that when I was researching this, I watched a number of episodes of Mr. Wizard from the 1950s. And then I also wound up watching some of the reboot, the later reboot from the 70s, and there was one in the 80s as well. And the interesting thing is that the one in the 80s, all of the science that they're having the girls do is very gendered. It's like, let's see about, the science of lipstick. I'm not kidding. I don't think that was Mr. Wizard, but I have actually seen the science of lipstick, and again, very stabby. The 1950s one is not gendered at all. The little girls are in skirts, absolutely, but they're like, let's look at thermodynamics. Let's look at how we create batteries. And he speaks to them and addresses them exactly as he would little boys. So in terms of space flight, I think, space is a great topic. And that's, in terms of something that is specifically about women, one of the things that I would say is have them look at the early aviation pioneers. Her name is not in my head right now. But does anyone want to make a guess about what year, so first of all, the first professional aeronaut, and that should give you a clue right there. First professional aeronaut was a woman. Does anyone want to guess about what year this was? 1811. Right? 1811, this woman was employed by Napoleon for her ballooning skills. So I would say, I wish I could remember her name. I would also say, look at Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman was the first African-American woman pilot. It was not legal for her to be a pilot in the United States. She couldn't get a license, and this is in I want to say 1911, 1912, very, very early. So the only place that she could get a license to fly was in Paris. So she taught herself French, went to France, got the pilot's license, came back. So looking at the early pioneers of, I think, they are the ones who often are most written out of history because we've had the most time to write them out of history. So I would look at those. There's a great book called Black Wings, which is about African-American aviation that talks about Bessie Coleman. I would also say Promise to the Moon, which is the story of the Mercury 13 women. There's a good documentary about them. So Mercury 13 is also like, what would space look like if that program hadn't been shut down? I think about this all the time.
I'm interested in kind of like the release timing between Calculating Sky
Calculating Stars and Faded Sky.
And Faded Sky, which are only like 3 months apart release date.
It's not even 3 months.
And my wife just read Maureen Johnson's most recent book, only to discover that it's really half a book and that the rest of the thriller is still not yet to be released. What was your sort of like thought process behind like, let's get that out in this time frame and not wait 6 months or whatever?
So Calculating Stars came out July 3rd. Faded Sky came out August 21st, which is very fast. My basic thought process on that was that my publisher said, would you like to do this thing? And I said, yes, I would like to do that thing. The reason that this is an interesting publishing strategy to try when you have an author who can turn 2 books out that fast. I wrote the second book in like 6 months, which is very fast for hard science fiction. The reason is because there is a known phenomenon that when the first book in a series comes out, there's a bump. Like there's something we call the series death spiral. So the 5th book in my series did not sell as well as the first book by a lot. But the moment I have a book come out in a new series, there's a bump, and we know that. So you want new books coming out. And then we also know that a lot of people are completists. They will wait until an entire series is finished before they buy any of them. And then when the last book comes out, there's a bump in the sales of the first book. So if you can get both of them coming out within about a month of each other, you have both of those phenomena happening at the same time, and the book sells significantly better. So that's basically, that was the experiment that they wanted to try. And it has worked. Like when I look at the diagram of my book sales, it's like, these books are doing very nicely, and then Calculating Stars happens, and it's way up here. So it definitely worked. There's also a number of other things that are happening with Calculating Stars, bringing out a space book the same year as the 60th anniversary of NASA, and the year before the 50th anniversary of Apollo. There's a lot of, the timing is good. I hit zeitgeist as well, but that's why they wanted to bring them out back to back like that.
And as a reader, it was so exciting to get to the end of the first book and go, oh, I only have to wait a short amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing that we did not think through was, or when I said, yes, that sounds great, was that it meant that I had to do all that promotion as well, because usually you promote the first book for about 2 weeks before it comes out, and then there's another 2 weeks of rah, rah, new book. When they're coming out back to back, it's just basically like just promotion all the time, which was, I mean, fun. It's a good problem to have, but whoa, was not expecting it.
Sure. Well, thanks again for coming out and for the reading, and for adding us to your promotional docket.
Well, thank you for being in the city I live in.
Yeah, happy to. Well, great. Thanks a lot, Mary Robinette.